that was where we had our first sort of what was called a break. Probably it was only about 3 weeks, a month off before we did something. Probably 3 weeks actually. But Robert and I went to into the country in Wales to an isolated cottage. It was so isolated that there was no electricity there even. It was just gaslight, gas cooking, and the only electricity we had but in these cassette things for reference, and the electricity we generated together. But because, for instance, the second album had been recorded while we were on the road, basically, so they had all the energy of rock and roll touring in it, lots of rock riffs. But of course now, we were off the road, right in the middle of the countryside, and totally, mellowed out, so to speak, and that reflects in the music that was written there.
I guess.
Of course, we did it on acoustic guitars because, you couldn't use electric.
But was it like 3-4 years in the making, that record?
4 years.
Like heavy metal. Like you had always been into the acoustic guitar there. Had you always had in the back of your mind an idea for an acoustic-oriented album? Because I guess about half of that album was sort of acoustic tracks.
No, that's not the way it is. No. But I always wanted to employ the acoustic guitar right from the start. No, I'd say the way that even though I'd use this sort of starting with the acoustic, for instance, Gallows Pole, and bringing in the Brown Age, I wanted to come up with, and even Your Time Is Going to Come, another one which is sort of comes into it's heavily acoustic oriented. Nevertheless, I wanted to come up with something which really summarised everything, and with the electric and the acoustic. We're going back really to this sort of Babe, I'm Gonna Leave You almost, and that was like the whole structure for Stairway was built around this idea. But that was taken from like the acoustic introduction, taking it right through to like a climax at the end. But you see, even that broke rules, because the one thing that musicians don't do, are told never to do, and it's totally taboo, is to speed up or slow down. Well, there's that as I say, broke all the rules, because it speeds up all the way through to reach this climax at the end.
I'll clear up the record before going on to the next chronological period. Is when you were doing these sessions back in the mid-'60s, there's the legend of you doing the solo on You Really Got Me by the Kinks. Is that actually you?
I played on the Kinks records, yes.
You didn't
I played on quite a number of Kinks records, as did a drummer. I mean, it wasn't even the Kinks drummer on those things either. And he played the drums. Yeah.
But did you actually do a solo there?
I did solos on the Kinks records.
But you don't remember about that particular track?
Well, I've answered the question. Why is it so important about the Kinks?
Just the truth.
Me ask a question. Why is it so important?
じゃあ反対に聞きたいんだけど、そのキンクスのことは何でその重要なのか。
いや、なんか単なるミーハーなのか。
いや、雑学的なね、好奇心っていう。
Just trivia. Get a trivial answer then.
ものすごくファンだから、自分のみんなジミー・ペイジがやってると思うとすごく幸せな気分になるんだ。
You see, for the true Jimmy Page fans, derive happiness from the fact that knowing you're playing on that song, as opposed to somebody else.
Yeah, no, I was on the Kinks records.
Okay,
Yeah. You see, the thing is, it's Ray Davis who says that I was never on any Kinks records, right? Is this what we're getting at? Well, this is a fact. You see, he says that I was never on any Kinks records, but I was. But and it gets boring. But the other side of this coin is that I was also on the Who's Can't Explain.
Is that right?
And I wasn't needed. I wasn't needed on that at all. And it's. I was just playing the riff on that. Townsend did the lead on that. But he was fine about it. He was overjoyed that I was on it, because, he sort of respected my playing.
Why didn't Townsend do it himself?
He did. That's what I'm saying. He did. I was just backing up the riff at the, underneath. on that. But you know, it's just a difference between two different people.
Oh, I see, yeah.
You know.
Yeah. それに引っかかったのは、レイビスはもうずっとながらに、Did you decide to form Zeppelin like in the waning days of the Yardbirds then?
No, because we were doing so well in America on basically on an underground scene. We weren't getting hit records anymore, especially once we met Mickey Most. It was some of probably the worst records were done, really, in a way, representative to what we were doing on stage. He wasn't interested in albums, even though things were now moving into an album market. You know, he was just interested in singles, and in fact he got us to record some stuff which was really horrific, actually. And it used to be the sort of thing, well, let's just try it, we don't have to put it out. You know, once people, I've learned from those days, once people say that, you're in trouble if you do it. But sure, I had ideas of how I'd like things to go with the Yardbirds, but for instance, I'll tell you the sort of things we were doing on stage. We had one number called Glimpses, and I was doing things with the bow and playing back tapes in the background of different things. You know, it was getting quite arty in its way, and we were getting great receptions in America. And but it was mainly Keith. You see, don't forget, already one guy had already split from the band. And I was there when he did it, Paul Samuel Smith, the bass player, and he said, and if I was you, Keith, I'd leave as well. And this was way back, you know, before I'd even gone in there. So, you know, maybe the whole excitement for them of the band had just gone. Well, as I've already said, you know, the quote of Keith Relf. So even though I could see a lot of potential in what we were doing musically, you know, they didn't have their hearts in it, and I guess that, you know, that's all that has to be said, really. If you don't have your heart in something, it's not going to be any good, is it?
So one of the seeds for...
So, obviously the ideas that I had, sure, you know, that became the backbone of whatever the band was going to be, and it became Led Zeppelin. And I was just very fortunate that I came across the other musicians. I mean, it was almost as though it was destined to be, really.
You knew you were going to do another project?
I knew I was going to do, yeah, sure, what was I going to do? Yeah, I was
Go back to the studio.
yeah, I always go back to art college, yeah.
Of course, also a hypothetical question. You know, you had the concept in your mind for the next project, and after a while, I guess you had John Paul Jones as well. If you hadn't come across Robert Plant and Bonzo, do you think you would have gone to make something very similar, or would it have been quite a bit different from what you got?
It wouldn't have been as good, that's for sure. Yeah. The way things happened was that I started to search for musicians, and I went to see, well, actually the person that I had in mind was a chap, purely because I'd been on a tour with the Yardbirds. This is a wonderful bill, let me tell you. If you can picture this, there was this guy called Terry Reid,
Yeah, sure.
who was in a band called Peter J and the Jaywalkers. They opened up the show, then it was Ike and Tina Turner review, intermission, Yardbirds and the Rolling Stones. What a wonderful bill, eh? But anyway, I knew of his voice, and I thought, that's the guy I want to get, because I wanted to get someone who, you know, real ballsy singer, sort of like a Steve Marriott type, you know, this sort of thing was there. And I called him up, and curiously enough, he'd just signed up to Mickey Most, the man that I'd just left. So he couldn't do it, but he recommended Robert. And I went to see Robert, and he was singing in a teacher's training college where I saw him. He was tarmacking by day.
What's that?
Tarmacking, laying tarmac roads. Right, okay. And you know, I got him down to my place to really illustrate to him what I had in mind, because he'd been in bands up there, you know, playing around for quite a while, you know, and nothing had happened with him. And he had played with John Bonham, and in fact, there's in that box set there's a picture of him. There's 2 years prior to Led Zeppelin. So, you know, although they had played in the past. And so Robert, mapped this thing out to him. Fortunately, he had enough vision and imagination to give it a shot. And at that point, that's when John Paul Jones, who knew that I'd, left sessions anyway to join the Yardbirds when I did, basically to play with Jeff, because we were good friends. He called me up, and we still didn't have a drummer, although I had a drummer in mind, and I knew exactly what, it needed a powerhouse type of drummer, like a sort of, the Keith Moon type of thing, but with a little more invention to it. I had somebody in mind. He said, let's go and see, would you come and see this chap, John Bonham? He said, I think it's the way you're describing this, it's just exactly the right sort of thing. The moment I saw him, that was it. He was going to be the drummer, all right. He was playing with a chap called Tim Rose, who did Hey Joe, which Hendrix did. Hendrix covered Hey Joe, but he was touring around England, and John Bonham was the drummer. And I think probably that's of any named people, that's the only one you can really sort of say that John Bonham had played with, apart from the groups in the Midlands, as Robert had. But he wasn't sure whether he wanted to join the group. It took quite a lot of convincing to get him in. Now, for whatever reason this is, I don't know. I'll leave it to your imagination to think why at this point he wasn't sure whether he wanted to join the group, as he'd played with Robert in the past. So, however, we got him down, and we just had one rehearsal. So really, this band came together very, very quickly, in fact. This is why I say it almost had to be destined. Just from the one rehearsal that we had, in a very small rehearsal room, no bigger than this, we just knew straight away that was it.
Just making an order for batteries, you're getting a little... There were rumors to the effect that when you first asked Robert to join the band, you said something to the effect that...
First album, and I was paying retainers to both Robert Plant and John Bonham, hoping that the band would take off to the degree where then it would I'd be paid back what I'd put in, and then everyone was on an equal share after that. So it didn't take, it actually didn't take that long, did it, really?
But you put yourself out of...
I put myself on the line for what I believed in. I always do. I always have and always will.
When you guys first went into the studio, I guess Robert and John Bonham had very little experience. They hadn't been in the studio. What was the weight on your shoulders to do most of the work?
Well, the good thing about it, of course, was that John Paul Jones was a seasoned campaigner in the studio. I had done production before anyway with a defunct label which Andrew Oldham had called Immediate Records. I produced on. In fact, I produced Nico. You remember Nico?
Yeah, sure.
Velvet Underground. But, so I'd done a bit of production anyway. So I think it helped. The other important thing was that I'd learnt a lot from being in the studio as a session musician, and I knew what not to do, which was to put a drummer in a little drum booth, which everybody did, and I knew that wasn't the way to do it, and that because I've been on some wonderful sessions where the drummers had played their hearts out and it sounded like they were hitting old suitcases, and I knew that I had definite ideas of how things should be done, how they should be recorded. And the first thing was to get the drums into an area where they could breathe, and you get all the harmonics and they'd sound like drums, So of course that, for a start, that made, even if he'd been in the studio before, I don't know whether he had or not, I knew, he was going to give him confidence because the drums were going to sound right for a change, Robert Plant had a few solo records out, so he'd been in the studio at least, but it just and the added part of it as well was that we'd actually routine this material, and we'd had a little mini tour of Scandinavia, which actually was an old commitment that was left over from the Yardbirds, and so we were pretty confident that we knew what we were doing when we went in, and I knew how to get it sounding right, and that was that.
So things really clicked in the studio. It wasn't like kind of struggling, and I said, well, no, that's how.
Well, we knew it wasn't going to be a struggle because we knew right from that first rehearsal and the tour that we were doing, we were playing well, we gelled.